Welcome back, fans, and greetings, newcomers, to another spectacular slaughterfest on Grudge Match Unlimited, the show that takes our favorites from fiction and hypothesizes what would happen if they were to cross paths in single combat. Today is a special match because we will seek to answer that age-old question, pitting two of the oldest, most popular, and widespread monsters against each other. For today, it's the battle for the ages. It's vampire versus werewolf. Both of these creatures have a variety of different styles and abilities they come with depending on what media you're looking at, going all the way back to ancient mythology. So in order to compare them, we're going to have to do so in a few different rounds. We're going to look at their original myths, we're going to look at their more modern literary and magical versions, and then finish off with modern fiction and the more biological form these creatures have taken in recent years. So starting off with the original myths that both of these beings came from, they go back all the way as far as human history goes. All the way back into mythology, there are stories and myths of characters and creatures who take on some of the abilities and similarities of the more modern vampire and werewolf. But the common conception of the term vampire came from 18th century Eastern Europe. There have been many different cultural creatures who sucked blood and came back from the dead all throughout history, but vampire, sort of as we know them today, really originated in 18th century Eastern Europe. But even though it was a precursor to modern vampires, there was a lot of differences from the vampires of those legends to the ones we have today. They were somebody who had died and was coming back to life after death in order to feed on the blood of the living. However, they were mostly just reanimated corpses back then. They were thought of as being shambling and disheveled looking and covered in the dirt from their graves because they would have to go back to their graves every morning before the sun rose, because these vampires also had an aversion to the sun. But they weren't thought of as attractive or particularly intelligent. They were kind of more like zombies, but they didn't look all desiccated because they would often be filled with the blood of the victims they drank from. So they often appeared very bloated and dark skin because of the blood pooling up underneath their skin. And they had all the classic vulnerabilities of most modern-day vampires: the aversion to sun, being able to kill them by decapitating them, fire, stake through the heart, or garlic would also ward them off, as well as holy relics, symbols of Christianity or almost any religious faith could ward them off or hurt them. So they had all the basic vulnerabilities, but they didn't have all of the powers that we normally associate with vampires. They did have enhanced strength and speed, and it was very difficult to kill them if you weren't using the things they were specifically vulnerable to, but they didn't have things like hypnotism or shape-shifting or the ability to command animals or enthrall humans. They were, in many ways, kind of just a mindless corpse who was reanimated to drink from the living. The original myths of werewolves also go back into ancient myth, but the modern conception of them came mostly from 15th century Germanic origins. And they were very, very different from the type of werewolves that we know today, in that most of those original werewolves were thought to be werewolves by choice. Mostly that was through either making a pact with the devil, or they were witches who created spells in order to change into a wolf. Most often they would have either a pelt of wolf skin that had been specially treated with potions and magic spells, and when they put it on, they would take on the form of a large wolf-like beast, and they would run about snatching children, killing townsfolk, and generally wreaking havoc. And these werewolves could change at will. They were not forced to change by the full moon. They could change whenever they wanted, and that allowed them to blend very seamlessly into society in the towns and villages that they lived in. They were very smart, very cunning and wily, and this allowed them to be a great threat to their communities. Now, in a fight between these two types of creatures, these original myth vampires and werewolves, the edge is going to have to go to the werewolf, because the vampire was thought of as not that intelligent and really just a reanimated corpse. Werewolves were more intelligent, and they were also having all of the powers, the speed, strength, and viciousness associated with a large direwolf creature. So for the original myths, the werewolves are going to take the win. Moving on to the more literary versions that became popularized in the 19th and 20th centuries. For vampires, this was mostly popularized by Bram Stoker's famous work Dracula in 1897. And it started off a litany of vampire writings and movies and everything that's followed all the way through till today. This was an entirely new kind of vampire that hadn't really been seen before with Dracula. So this was all the powers associated with the original myth vampires, the enhanced strength and speed and difficulty to kill, but this type of vampire was much more smart, was much more capable in terms of being able to control humans and animals. This type of vampire could shapeshift themselves into a bat or even a wolf or mist, fog, into a horde of rats or insects. This type of vampire could enthrall humans and have an army of humans at their disposal. This type of vampire had a lot of magical powers, including levitation and pyrokinesis, flight, all this kind of stuff. So this is probably the most powerful version of vampire that ever existed, this early literary version. A lot of the same vulnerabilities came into play in terms of religious symbolism, being able to ward them off, aversion to sunlight, wooden stakes through the heart, and the like, but the massive level of power that these vampires tended to have made all of those things very difficult to utilize. The early version of werewolves, from the literary versions, came mostly from the early literature and films of the 1930s and 1940s, most famously Universal's classic movie, The Wolfman. Now, this type of werewolf was very different from the original myth. Whereas the original myth werewolves were werewolf by choice, these werewolves were normal people who were cursed, usually because they'd been bitten by another werewolf. And then every time the moon rose, the full moon came up, they would turn into a beast, half human, half wolf monster, and would totally lose their mind, lose control of themselves, and would be compelled to kill, usually, their loved ones. So this type of werewolf is the first type that was actually vulnerable to silver. Prior to this type of werewolf, only fire or beheading would sufficiently kill a werewolf. But for the first time, silver came in as a vulnerability to the werewolf. So with these early literary versions of these creatures, the vampire is going to take the win. Not only because of their enhanced powers beyond what they had in their original myths, but also they've become much smarter and much more capable, whereas the werewolf in this version has come down in power. No longer intelligent, no longer in control of themselves during the change, but a cursed human instead. So for the literary and early fictional versions, the vampire takes the win. Moving on to the third round, this is the modern fiction and more biological versions of these creatures. Modern movies like Underworld, Blade, and television like Being Human, Grimm, or Supernatural are depicting both vampires and werewolves as less magical creatures than they used to be considered in fiction, and more as immortal creatures of great physical power whose abilities and weaknesses are rooted in biology. Admittedly unrealistic, shaky biology, but biology all the same, where the transformation into a werewolf or to a vampire creature is usually considered the result of a virus that rewrites the person's DNA and gives them their abilities and their weaknesses. In these versions of vampires and werewolves, vampires always tend to be more successful as a group, mostly because they have a stronger sense of community. In films like Underworld or in television like Being Human, the underground subculture of vampirism is always highly organized and very powerful. So this allows the vampires to be the most dominant supernatural creature. But a lot of their power from the earlier fictional works has gone away. No longer are they able to shapeshift into bats or wolves or mist. No longer are they able to have pyrokinesis or telekinesis. And they're mostly reliant on physical strength. They still have the greatly enhanced physical strength and speed, the immortality, and most of their magical weaknesses have gone away as well. No longer are vampires susceptible to religious artifacts, can't be warded off by crosses, and aren't burned by holy water. The aversion to sunlight continues, as well as does the notion of beheading. Burning them can also kill them, and the stake through the heart, wooden stake through the heart, seems to have also survived as the primary notion of how to kill a vampire. Modern-day, more biological versions of werewolves, also seen in things like Underworld, Being Human, and Supernatural, have lost their magical origins as well, and you sometimes get the versions who are forced to change. They're bit by a werewolf, and whenever the full moon rises, they change and lose control of themselves. But you also get other versions that are more in control of themselves and can change whenever they choose to. Whether you're dealing with the ones that can change whenever they want or the ones that are forced to, they tend to have great physical strength and speed, more so than the vampires even. In almost any modern-day depiction of vampire versus werewolf, when a vampire fights a fully changed, transformed werewolf, the werewolf tends to be stronger, faster, and more resilient. Also, the werewolves have fewer weaknesses than the vampires, because silver tends to be the only weakness specific to werewolves, as well as beheading and fire, but that works for both of them. And when it comes to those weaknesses, a wooden stake through the heart is going to be much easier to come by than a silver bullet through the heart. Any piece of wood can work for a stake, whereas silver tends to be a lot more difficult to come by. But the vampire still does have the advantage in intelligence, even in these modern biological version of the characters. So who wins in the modern conception of the characters? When it comes to a fight, that's got to be the werewolf. Because even though modern vampires can have access to silver bullets, modern werewolves can also have access to high-grade weaponry as well, as we saw in the Underworld series, including bullets fused with ultraviolet radiation that could kill the vampires from within. And as stated, if it comes down to just a bare-knuckle fight between a vampire and a werewolf, the werewolf is going to be stronger, faster, and more resilient than the vampire. So, in 3 rounds, werewolves taking 2 rounds, the ancient myths and the modern biological fiction is going to put werewolves just a bit ahead and winner of this Grudge Match Unlimited. Now, there are several different versions of werewolves and vampires that this match didn't necessarily consider, including the White Wolf tabletop role-playing version from Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf the Forsaken, as well as specific other types of movies and specific literature where their powers and weaknesses differ slightly. So it's possible that a round 2 version of vampires versus werewolves will be done in the future. But for this episode and for this match, it's going to be werewolves as the winner. Thanks for watching. Leave me any comments below with any suggestions for future matches. We'll see you next time on the next edition of Grudge Match Unlimited.